The mansion's silence shattered like glass when Marcus Blackwood pushed open the nursery door 3 hours early. What he witnessed in that golden afternoon light would either destroy everything he thought he knew about boundaries, or force him to confront what his 6-month-old son truly needed. Vivian Hartwell sat in the antique rocking chair, her eyes closed, his baby boy Ethan nursing peacefully at her breast. The woman he'd hired just 3 weeks ago, the one who spoke only when necessary and avoided his gaze, had crossed the one line he'd drawn in stone. The manila folder containing her contract slipped from his trembling fingers. In that devastating moment of silence, one question burned through his mind. How had a millionaire who controlled every detail of his world failed to see what was happening right under his nose? Marcus Blackwood had built his fortune on one fundamental principle: trust no one, especially when money was involved. At 34, his tech empire was worth $50 million, but beneath the success lived a man haunted by betrayal so profound it had nearly destroyed him. 6 months ago, everything had seemed perfect. His wife Sophia was 8 months pregnant, glowing with the kind of radiant beauty that made other men envious. She'd quit her marketing job to focus on preparing for motherhood, spending his money on designer nursery furniture and organic everything. Marcus had indulged her every whim, believing he was investing in their future happiness. Then came the night she'd sat him down in his study, her manicured hands folded calmly in her lap, and delivered the words that shattered his world. "I'm leaving, Marcus. I never wanted this baby. I only stayed for the money, and frankly, being married to you isn't worth any amount of wealth." She'd been planning her exit for months, he learned later from her voicemails left behind. The pregnancy had been an accident she'd hidden until it was too late for her preferred solution. She'd stayed long enough to give birth, signed over all parental rights for a substantial settlement, and disappeared to Europe with her personal trainer, the man she'd apparently been seeing throughout their entire marriage. "Nothing personal," she'd said as she walked out, carrying designer luggage he'd bought her. "You're just too controlling, too cold, too obsessed with your precious schedules and rules. I want to live freely, not trapped in your sterile little world." Marcus had been left with a newborn son, a devastated sense of trust, and a burning determination never to let another money-hungry woman manipulate him again, especially not around his child. The first 2 nannies had been carefully vetted through elite agencies, chosen specifically for their sterling credentials and hefty price tags. Mrs. Wellington had possessed a degree from Oxford and 20 years' experience with wealthy families. Miss Richardson had come with references from senators and CEOs. Both had treated Ethan with professional competence while maintaining the emotional distance Marcus preferred. But both had also quit within weeks, citing his impossible standards and micromanagement. Marcus had simply shrugged. He'd rather change nannies monthly than risk exposing Ethan to another Sophia. Then his assistant Janet had suggested posting with local employment services instead of exclusive agencies. Maybe someone who actually needs the job will be more committed, she'd reasoned. That's how Vivian Hartwell had arrived at his door on a rainy Tuesday morning, clutching a bus transfer and a resume so sparse it barely filled half a page. No fancy credentials, no references from powerful families, just 5 years of scattered childcare experience and an obvious desperation for steady employment that should have sent Marcus running. Instead, something about the way she'd held Ethan during the interview, with genuine tenderness rather than practiced professionalism, had made him ignore every instinct screaming warnings about hiring someone so clearly in need of money. He'd been regretting that decision every day since. Vivian never asked for advances on her salary, never hinted about expensive gifts for Ethan, never suggested upgrades to the nursery that would require additional spending. But Marcus had caught her studying the family photos with an intensity that suggested calculation rather than curiosity. He'd noticed how she'd lingered near his home office when he was on business calls, how she'd asked casual questions about his schedule and travel plans. Most damning of all, he'd overheard her on the phone with someone, speaking in hushed tones about a good situation and playing it right. The conversation had ended abruptly when she'd noticed him nearby, and she'd offered no explanation despite his pointed questions. Now this, the ultimate violation of boundaries, the most intimate transgression possible. She was literally feeding his child from her own body, creating the kind of physical and emotional bond that could never be undone. It was exactly the sort of manipulation Sophia might have attempted, using Ethan's vulnerability to secure her own position. "Get away from him," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the nursery's peaceful atmosphere like a blade. Right now, Vivian's eyes flew open, and the terror in her expression only confirmed his worst suspicions. She was caught, exposed, scrambling for an explanation that might save her scheme. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, carefully detaching Ethan from her breast. "I can explain. I'm sure you can. I'm sure you have a very touching story about how this somehow benefits my son rather than securing your own position in this household." Marcus stepped forward, every muscle tense with fury. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I was stupid enough to let you manipulate me the same way my wife did?" Vivian wrapped Ethan in his blanket and placed him in his crib with trembling hands. The baby whimpered at the interruption, but she didn't dare pick him up again, with Marcus radiating such dangerous energy. "I would never manipulate you," she said quietly. "Ethan was crying for over an hour, refusing every bottle, and I was afraid—" "You were afraid I'd fire you for incompetence, so you decided to make yourself indispensable instead." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Very clever. Create a nursing relationship so intimate that removing you would traumatize my son. I have to admire the strategy." "That's not what this is," Vivian protested. But Marcus had heard enough. "Pack your things. I want you out of this house within the hour." He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling security to escort you off the property." "Please, just listen. I listened to my wife's lies for 2 years. I won't make that mistake again." Marcus's voice was ice cold. "You people are all the same. You see money and think you can seduce your way into it. Well, congratulations, Miss Hartwell. You just earned yourself a one-way ticket back to whatever desperate situation you crawled out of." The words hit their mark. Vivian flinched as if he'd struck her, and Marcus saw something break behind her eyes. Good. Maybe now she'd understand that he wasn't as naive as she'd assumed. "I'll get my things," she said, her voice barely audible. "You have 45 minutes. The locks will be changed tonight." Marcus remained in the nursery as Vivian's footsteps echoed through the house, fighting the urge to comfort Ethan, who had begun crying again. Let the baby cry. Better he learn early that people couldn't be trusted, that attachments led only to pain and abandonment. His phone rang. Janet probably calling about the quarterly reports he'd abandoned when his migraine had driven him home early. "Not now." He snapped into the phone. "Marcus, what's wrong? You sound—" "I just fired the nanny, again. Find me a replacement by tomorrow morning." What happened? Vivian seemed like she was working out well. Vivian was running a con game, just like Sophia. Marcus watched Ethan's face grow red with distress. "I want someone older this time. Post-menopausal. Someone who can't manipulate me with her body or maternal instincts." "Marcus, are you sure you're not overreacting? Maybe there's an explanation." "There's always an explanation, Janet. There's always some sob story designed to tug at heartstrings and open wallets. I'm done being anyone's mark." He hung up and stared down at his screaming son, wondering how long it would take to find another nanny willing to work with his requirements. The agencies would blacklist him soon if he kept going through employees at this rate. But better that than risking another Sophia. Better loneliness than betrayal. 40 minutes later, Marcus watched from his study window as Vivian walked down the long driveway toward the main road, carrying the same small suitcase she'd brought 3 weeks earlier. She moved slowly, her shoulders curved inward as if protecting herself from invisible blows. At the gate, she turned back towards the house for just a moment, and even from this distance, Marcus could see her hand press against her mouth as if stifling a sob. He told himself it was just another performance, another calculated appeal to his sympathies. But something about her defeated posture nagged at him, an uncomfortable recognition he didn't want to examine too closely. Ethan's cries had escalated to the kind of breathless screaming that suggested genuine distress rather than simple hunger. Marcus had tried everything he could think of: bottles, pacifiers, rocking, singing, even playing the classical music Sophia had insisted would stimulate infant brain development. Nothing worked. By evening, both father and son were exhausted. Ethan had finally cried himself to sleep from pure exhaustion, but he'd taken barely 2 ounces of formula all day. Marcus paced the nursery, his migraine returning with vengeful intensity as he wondered whether he should call Dr. Williams for an emergency consultation. His laptop chimed with an incoming email. Janet sending him contact information for 3 potential nannies who could start immediately. All were over 50, all had sterling references, all charged fees that made Marcus's former employees look budget-friendly. Perfect, he muttered, scrolling through their credentials. Expensive enough to appreciate the job, old enough to be immune to romantic delusions. But as he prepared to respond to Janet's email, another message caught his attention, from an address he didn't recognize, with a subject line that made his stomach clench. About Ethan's care. Marcus hesitated, his finger hovering over the delete button. He'd specifically told Vivian never to contact him again, had made it clear that any attempt at communication would result in legal action. But curiosity overrode caution, and he opened the message. Mr. Blackwood, I know you never want to hear from me again, but I'm worried about Ethan. He's been rejecting formula for the past week, showing signs of digestive distress that suggest possible lactose intolerance or other feeding issues. I've been documenting his patterns and planned to discuss this with you, but our arrangement ended before I could raise my concerns. I've attached my observations and some research about alternative feeding options. Please share this with his pediatrician. Whatever you think of me personally, Ethan's health should be the priority. I also want you to know that I never intended to manipulate you or your son. I understand why you would assume the worst, given your experiences, but my only goal was to ensure Ethan felt loved and secure. I failed in that mission, and I'm sorry. Vess Hartwell. Marcus stared at the message for a long time, his anger warring with something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. The attachment contained detailed notes about Ethan's feeding patterns, times and amounts consumed, instances of spitting up, periods of unusual fussiness. The documentation was thorough, professional, and clearly motivated by genuine concern rather than any attempt at manipulation. At the bottom of the notes was a single line that hit him like a physical blow. Baby's weight appears to be plateauing. Recommend immediate pediatric consultation to rule out failure to thrive. Failure to thrive. The phrase sent ice through Marcus's veins as he realized he'd been so focused on protecting himself from manipulation that he'd missed signs his son might be struggling nutritionally. He called Dr. Williams immediately. Marcus, it's nearly 10 p.m. Is everything all right? I need to bring Ethan in first thing tomorrow morning. I think there might be feeding issues. What kind of issues? Marcus found himself reading from Vivian's notes, describing symptoms he'd been too distracted to notice himself. Dr. Williams listened with growing concern. How long has this been going on? According to the nanny's documentation, about a week. Maybe longer. The nanny who documented this, Is she trained in infant care? She was. Past tense. I fired her today. There was a pause. Marcus, may I ask why? Marcus opened his mouth to explain about the breastfeeding incident, about his suspicions of manipulation, about his determination never to be used again. But the words stuck in his throat as he stared at Vivian's carefully detailed observations about his son's health. Professional differences? He said finally. I see. Well, bring Ethan in at 8 a.m. sharp. And Marcus, if this nanny was observant enough to document these patterns, you might want to reconsider whatever differences you had. Good infant care providers are harder to find than you might think. After hanging up, Marcus sat in his study for hours, staring at Vivian's email and the meticulous care she'd taken to ensure Ethan's well-being, even after being fired. The notes revealed a level of attention to his son's needs that went far beyond professional obligation. This wasn't the behavior of someone running a con game. This was the behavior of someone who genuinely cared about a child's welfare, regardless of personal cost. At 2 a.m., Marcus finally admitted what he'd been avoiding all evening. He might have made a terrible mistake. Dr. Williams confirmed Marcus's worst fears the next morning. Ethan had lost 4 ounces since his last visit, was showing signs of dehydration, and was clearly struggling with the formula that should have been providing adequate nutrition. He needs breast milk, the doctor said bluntly after completing his examination. Some babies simply can't tolerate artificial alternatives, especially when they're under stress. Stress. Babies are more sensitive to household disruption than most people realize. Changes in caregivers, emotional tension in their environment, alterations to established routines, all of these can affect their ability to feed and thrive. Marcus thought about the past 24 hours, about Ethan's desperate crying, about the way his son had seemed almost frantic every time he'd tried to offer a bottle. What are my options? Donor milk from a certified bank, though that's expensive and not always readily available. Or... Dr. Williams hesitated. Was the nanny you fired actually nursing him? Yes. The admission came out like a confession. Was this her suggestion or yours? Neither. I found her doing it without permission. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. I assumed she was trying to manipulate me. Dr. Williams studied Marcus's expression with the careful neutrality of someone who'd dealt with difficult parents before. Marcus, I've been practicing pediatric medicine for 20 years. In my experience, women don't initiate breastfeeding for manipulative purposes. It's too physically demanding, too emotionally intimate. If she was nursing Ethan, it was because she believed he needed it. The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. Are you saying I was wrong? I'm saying that if a caregiver was willing to provide breast milk for your son without being asked, and if that caregiver was attentive enough to document feeding problems you hadn't noticed, you might want to reconsider whatever assumptions led you to terminate her employment. Marcus left the doctor's office with a prescription for specialized formula and a growing certainty that he'd just destroyed the best thing that had happened to his son since birth. But finding Vivian again seemed impossible. He had no address, no phone number beyond the email account, no way to locate someone who'd probably rather never see him again. That afternoon, desperation drove him to call Janet with a request that made him feel smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. I need you to find Vivian Hartwell. She's staying at the YWCA downtown. Janet said quietly. Marcus, if you want to find her, you should know she's been at the library all day, applying for jobs. She has nothing left. Marcus found her at a computer terminal, surrounded by applications for minimum wage positions. When she saw him, her exhaustion was unmistakable. Miss Hartwell, I need to talk to you. About Ethan. He gestured toward his sleeping son. About how wrong I was. For the first time since he'd found her, Vivian's composure cracked slightly. Something flickered in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear. Mr. Blackwood, I don't think that's wise. What happened yesterday showed we have very different ideas about appropriate childcare. What happened yesterday showed I'm an idiot who let fear and past experiences override common sense. Marcus said quietly. Ethan is sick, Miss Hartwell. Dr. Williams says he needs breast milk, that some babies can't tolerate formula when they're under stress. Vivian's professional mask slipped entirely. He's not eating? Not since you left. He's lost weight, he's dehydrated, and I finally understand that you weren't trying to manipulate me yesterday. You were trying to save him. They walked to a small park across from the library, finding privacy on a weathered bench surrounded by autumn trees. Ethan remained sleeping in his carrier, but Marcus could see Vivian's eyes constantly returning to the baby with the kind of concern that couldn't be faked. Tell me what really happened yesterday. Marcus said, Everything you tried before you decided to nurse him. Vivian took a deep breath. He'd been refusing bottles for days, taking just enough to survive but clearly struggling. Yesterday was the worst. He'd only managed 2 ounces all morning, was crying constantly, seemed genuinely distressed. I tried different temperatures, different formulas, different feeding positions. Nothing worked. How long was he crying before you made the decision? Over an hour. The kind of desperate crying that breaks your heart because you know something is wrong. Vivian's voice grew soft. I called your office 3 times, left messages asking you to call back about feeding concerns. When you didn't respond, I had to make a choice. Marcus remembered his phone buzzing during meetings, remembered ignoring calls from unknown numbers in favor of business priorities. I'm sorry, I should have answered. You were working, I understood that. Vivian looked down at her hands. But I also understood that Ethan needed immediate help, and I was the only one there to provide it. Why didn't you tell me you were capable of nursing? Why keep it secret? Vivian was quiet for so long, Marcus began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I knew how it would look. A poor woman with no credentials, no references from wealthy families, offering to nurse a rich man's baby. I knew you'd assume I was trying to manipulate you. Were you? Even a little. Vivian met his eyes directly. Mr. Blackwood, I've been pumping and donating to a milk bank for 6 months. I started after I lost my daughter Emma to SIDS. She was 8 months old when she died, and I couldn't stop producing milk. The doctors said it was normal, that grief affects the body in different ways. So I donate it, because helping other babies is the only way I know how to honor her memory. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Vivian wasn't some calculating opportunist trying to worm her way into his fortune. She was a grieving mother who'd found purpose in caring for other people's children, someone who understood loss in ways that paralleled his own experience with betrayal. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry for what you've lost, and I'm sorry for how I treated you yesterday. And I'm sorry I didn't find a way to communicate better about Ethan's needs. Maybe if I'd been more insistent about discussing his feeding problems, yesterday's crisis could have been avoided. They sat in comfortable silence, watching autumn leaves drift across the park. Marcus found himself studying Vivian's profile, seeing details he'd missed during their professional interactions. The lines around her eyes spoke of grief and worry, but also of someone who'd learned to find joy in small moments. Her hands, gentle and sure when she'd nursed Ethan, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to physical work rather than easy living. Miss Hartwell, I'd like to offer you your position back, with significantly better terms and a sincere apology for my behavior. Vivian turned to look at him directly. What kind of terms? Double the salary. Living arrangements in the main house so you can respond to Ethan's needs immediately. Full authority over his feeding schedule and care decisions, with my support rather than my interference. And the nursing? Is exactly what Dr. Williams recommended. If you're willing to provide that care, I'll be grateful rather than suspicious. Vivian studied his face, as if trying to determine whether he truly understood what he was proposing. Mr. Blackwood, if I accept this position, if I provide that level of care for Ethan, everything changes. Nursing creates bonds that go beyond professional relationships. I won't be just an employee anymore. I'm counting on it, Marcus said honestly. Ethan needs more than professional care. He needs someone who'll love him unconditionally, who'll fight for his well-being even when it costs them personally. Yesterday proved you're that person. What about your concerns about manipulation, about women who might be interested in your money? Marcus looked down at Ethan, sleeping peacefully despite the turmoil of the past day. I've spent so much energy protecting myself from being used that I nearly destroyed the best thing that's happened to my son since he was born. Maybe it's time to stop letting Sophia's betrayal dictate every decision I make. Sophia. My ex-wife, Ethan's biological mother. She left us both when he was 2 days old, said she'd only stayed for the money and never wanted to be a mother. Marcus's voice was bitter. I've been assuming every woman since then was running the same con game. That must have been devastating. It was. But using that pain to hurt you and potentially harm Ethan was worse. Marcus extended his hand. Will you give us another chance, Miss Hartwell? Will you help me learn how to be the father he deserves? Vivian looked at his outstretched hand, then at Ethan, then back at Marcus. If I do this, you have to understand that I'm going to love your son like he's my own. That's the only way I know how to care for children. That's exactly what I'm hoping for. As they shook hands, Ethan began to stir in his carrier. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he looked confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then his gaze found Vivian's face, and his expression transformed into something that could only be described as relief and joy. Hello, sweetheart, Vivian whispered, lifting him from the carrier. I missed you, too. Ethan settled against her shoulder with the complete relaxation that spoke of absolute trust and security. The sound he made was one of pure contentment, the first peaceful noise Marcus had heard from his son in 24 hours. He's hungry, Vivian observed. Very hungry, I'd guess. Then let's go home, Marcus said, and for the first time since Sophia's betrayal, the word felt like it meant something more than just an address. 6 months later, Marcus woke to the sound of laughter echoing through the house. Not the careful quiet he'd once insisted upon, but genuine joy that seemed to bounce off every wall and settle into corners that had been empty too long. He found Vivian's in the kitchen, with 12-month-old Ethan strapped to her chest in a carrier, both of them apparently fascinated by the process of making pancakes. Ethan was babbling constantly now, reaching for everything within his grasp, clearly thriving under care that prioritized love over rigid schedules. Morning, family, Marcus said, entering the kitchen properly. Da-da! Ethan launched into excited baby talk at the sight of his father, arms waving with the kind of uninhibited enthusiasm that made every morning feel like Christmas. Someone's happy today, Marcus observed, reaching for his son. Ethan came to him readily now, no longer the tense, unhappy baby who'd struggled through those early months. He slept through the night, Vivian announced, transferring pancakes to a plate. First time in 2 weeks. I think he's finally adjusting to the new teeth coming in. The transformation in their household over the past 6 months had been remarkable. Vivian had moved into the guest suite closest to the nursery, creating an arrangement that allowed her to respond immediately to Ethan's needs while maintaining appropriate boundaries. More importantly, she'd helped Marcus learn to participate actively in his son's care, rather than just observing from a distance. "Any word from the lawyer about the adoption papers?" Vivian asked, settling Ethan in his high chair. "Should be finalized next week, then it's official. You'll be his legal mother with all the rights and protections that entails." Marcus poured coffee for both of them. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Vivian admitted, "but also excited. I've been thinking about what to do for his first birthday." Ethan's first birthday. Marcus realized with surprise that the milestone no longer felt like a reminder of Sophia's abandonment, but like a celebration of everything they'd built together. The three of them had become a family in ways that transcended legal documents or biological connections. "I have something for you," Marcus said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "Early birthday present." Inside were documents transferring half ownership of the house to Vivian's name. "I don't want you to ever worry about security again," he explained. "This is your home now, permanently. Regardless of what happens between us personally, you'll always have a place here with Ethan." Vivian stared at the papers in shock. "Marcus, this is too much. I can't accept—" "Yes, you can. Because it's not just about you anymore. It's about giving Ethan the stability of knowing his mother will always be secure." Marcus paused. "Besides, families share everything, don't they?" "Families," Vivian repeated softly. "Is that what we are? What would you like us to be?" "I'd like us to be honest about what's already happening," she said. "We're not just co-parents, Marcus. We care about each other in ways that go beyond Ethan's well-being." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He'd been aware of his growing feelings for Vivian for months, but hadn't been sure whether acknowledging them would complicate their arrangement. "Are you saying you'd like to explore something more personal between us?" "I'm saying I think we already are." Vivian smiled. "When was the last time you made plans that didn't include both of us? When did you stop thinking of this as your house and start thinking of it as our home?" Marcus realized she was right. Somewhere along the way, his concern for Vivian's happiness had become as important as ensuring Ethan's needs were met. He looked forward to their evening conversations as much as his morning time with his son. "I love you," he said quietly. "Not just as Ethan's mother, but as yourself, as the woman who taught me how to trust again, who brought joy back into this house. I love you too." Vivian's smile was radiant. "I have for months, but I was afraid to say anything because I didn't want to jeopardize what we'd built for Ethan." Marcus reached for her hand, marveling at how right it felt. "Are you sure about this? Once we cross this line, everything changes. Everything's been changing since the day you found me nursing your son," Vivian pointed out. "The only question is whether we're brave enough to embrace it." As if sensing the importance of the moment, Ethan clapped his hands and babbled something that sounded remarkably like Mama and Dada strung together. Both adults laughed, and Marcus felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble entirely. "I want to marry you," he said impulsively. "Not because it would be convenient, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Even knowing I come with no money, no connections, no social advantages, especially knowing that. You chose us despite having every reason to walk away after how I treated you. That's worth more than any fortune." 6 months later, they were married in the garden Marcus had finally allowed to be planted according to Vivian's designs rather than rigid landscape architecture. Ethan, now walking and chattering constantly, served as ring-bearer with help from Janet, who'd become not just Marcus's assistant, but a beloved family friend. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by people who'd witnessed their journey from suspicion to trust to love. Dr. Williams performed the honors, having become their family physician and the person who'd first helped Marcus understand what Vivian truly represented. "Dearly beloved," Dr. Williams began, "we gather today to celebrate the union of Marcus and Vivian, Two people who've learned that the greatest families are built not just from love, but from the courage to trust again after betrayal and loss. As they exchanged vows promising to honor the past while building their own future, Ethan toddled between them with joyful energy. When Marcus lifted him during the ring exchange, Ethan clapped and shouted, "Mama! Dada!" with the delighted certainty of a child who knew he was completely loved. Later, during the reception in their backyard, Marcus found himself watching Vivienne dance with Ethan while their guests celebrated around them. The scene felt perfect in a way that honored both healing and new beginnings. "No regrets?" Vivienne asked as they swayed together under lights strung between trees she'd chosen. "Only that it took me so long to recognize what was right in front of me," Marcus replied. "Only that I nearly destroyed the best thing that ever happened to us. We found each other when we were ready. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most broken ground." Marcus looked at his son, now 18 months old and thriving in ways that exceeded every hope he'd held during those difficult early months. Ethan was confident, joyful, and secure in the knowledge that he was loved unconditionally by two parents who'd chosen each other and him. "What do you think would have happened if I hadn't fired you that day?" Marcus asked quietly. "We probably would have stayed stuck in that careful professional distance forever," Vivienne said honestly. "Sometimes crisis forces growth that comfort never could." "And what would you say to someone like me now? Someone convinced that love is just another con game?" "I'd say that protecting yourself from pain also protects you from joy. That the people worth loving are the ones who stay when staying is hard, not when it's profitable." Vivienne looked up at him. "I'd say that trust is a choice you make every day, not a guarantee anyone can give you." The music ended, but they continued swaying together, reluctant to break the spell of the moment. Around them, their guests continued celebrating, but Marcus felt wrapped in the perfect peace of knowing he was exactly where he belonged. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" "For being patient with a scared, stubborn man who'd forgotten how to trust. For loving Ethan when I was too afraid to let myself love him properly. For proving that not everyone who needs something is trying to steal it." "You saved yourself, Marcus. I just helped you remember who you wanted to be." 2 years later, Marcus woke to the sound of multiple voices echoing through the house. Ethan, now 3.5, was apparently explaining something very important to his baby sister, 6-month-old Grace, who'd been named for the unexpected blessing she represented. "And this is your room, Gracie," Ethan was saying in his serious big brother voice. "Mama feeds you here, and Daddy reads stories, and I'm going to teach you everything when you get bigger." Marcus found them in the nursery, where Vivienne was nursing Grace, while Ethan sat cross-legged nearby, surrounded by books he'd apparently been reading to his sister. The scene was perfectly domestic, completely right in ways that still amazed him. "Morning, family," he said, entering the room. "Daddy." Ethan launched himself at Marcus with uninhibited enthusiasm. "I was telling Grace about our family." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that Mama Vivienne is the best mama ever, and you're the best daddy, and we have the best family because we all chose each other." Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. "And I told her that families don't have to start the same way, but they all need love to grow." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. At 3, Ethan already understood something it had taken Marcus years to learn: that the circumstances of family formation mattered less than the commitment to love unconditionally. "That's exactly right, buddy," Marcus said, lifting Ethan onto his shoulders. "And I told her about the picture," Ethan continued. "What picture?" Ethan pointed to the dresser, where a small framed photo sat among Grace's baby things. It showed Marcus and Vivienne on their wedding day, but also included a professional portrait of Sophia that Marcus had finally felt strong enough to display. "I told Grace that she has 2 mamas," Ethan explained matter-of-factly. "Mama Sophia, who gave her and me life, and Mama Vivian, who gives us love every day. And that's extra special because not everyone gets 2 mamas." Vivian looked up from nursing Grace, tears shining in her eyes. They'd worked carefully to help Ethan understand his origins without bitterness or confusion, presenting Sophia not as a villain, but as someone who'd made different choices that had ultimately led to their current happiness. "What did Grace think about that?" Marcus asked. "She can't talk yet, but she smiled real big. I think she likes having lots of people to love her." Later that morning, as Vivienne prepared breakfast while Grace napped and Ethan played nearby, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years ago, he'd been a man so damaged by betrayal that he'd nearly destroyed the very love he'd been seeking. Now he was surrounded by abundance he'd never thought to hope for. Ethan was growing into a confident, compassionate child who understood that families could be built in many ways. Grace was thriving under the care of parents who knew how precious and fragile new life could be. And Vivian had proven that love multiplied rather than diminished when shared freely. "Any regrets?" Vivian asked, echoing the question from their wedding day. "Only that I wasted so much time being afraid," Marcus replied honestly. "Only that I let Sophia's betrayal blind me to genuine love when it was standing right in front of me." "Fear served its purpose," Vivian said gently. "It kept you cautious until you were ready to trust wisely rather than desperately. And what about you? Any regrets about taking a chance on a bitter, suspicious millionaire?" "Only that it took you so long to fire me," she said with a grin. "If you'd trusted your instinct sooner, we might have figured this out months earlier." Marcus laughed, remembering his determination to maintain professional distance, while his heart had been quietly surrendering to the woman who'd taught him that love wasn't about control or guarantees, but about showing up consistently even when showing up was difficult. "I love our life," he said simply. "Even the chaos? Even when Ethan draws on walls and Grace cries at 3 a.m.? Especially then. Our chaos is proof that this house is filled with living, breathing love instead of sterile perfection." That evening, as they tucked both children into bed, Marcus marveled at how naturally their bedtime routines had evolved. Ethan insisted on kissing both parents and his baby sister goodnight, while Grace settled peacefully after her final nursing session with Vivian. "Sweet dreams, little man," Marcus whispered to Ethan. "Tomorrow we'll build more of those block towers." "And read more stories?" "As many as you want." In Grace's room, Vivian settled into the rocking chair that had witnessed so many transformations over the years. "Sleep well, sweetheart," she murmured. "Dream about all the adventures waiting for you." Standing in the hallway between their children's rooms, Marcus and Vivienne shared the kind of quiet moment that had become precious anchors in their busy lives. "Thank you," Marcus said, taking her hand. "For what this time?" "For teaching me that money can't buy love, but love can survive without money. For showing me that trust isn't about finding someone who'll never hurt you, but finding someone worth the risk of being hurt. You taught me something too," Vivian said softly. "What's that?" "That grief doesn't have to define us forever. That losing love doesn't mean we're broken beyond repair. That second chances are possible for people brave enough to believe in them." They walked downstairs together, ready to enjoy the quiet evening hours that belonged just to them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and learn together. But tonight Marcus felt nothing but gratitude for the unexpected family they'd built from the ruins of betrayal and loss. "I love you," he said as they settled on the couch with wine and the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. "I love you too, all of us, together, all of us." Marcus looked around their living room, seeing evidence of real life everywhere. Ethan's toys scattered near the fireplace, Grace's bouncy seat by the window, family photos documenting their journey from wary strangers to committed partners. It was exactly the kind of beautiful chaos he'd once thought he wanted to avoid. Now he understood that this mess, this noise, this wonderful complication of loving and being loved was what made a house into a home. And that the greatest fortune he'd ever accumulated wasn't measured in dollars, but in the trust freely given by people who'd chosen to build their lives alongside his. Marcus Blackwood had learned that love wasn't a business transaction to be managed and controlled, but a gift that multiplied when shared without reservation. He'd learned that the best families weren't always planned, but were often forged in the crucible of crisis and sealed with the commitment to keep choosing each other every day. Most importantly, he'd learned that when you stopped protecting yourself from love's risks, you discovered rewards beyond anything money could purchase. The sound of children's laughter filling empty rooms, the peace of partnership with someone who knew your worst qualities and chose you anyway, and the daily miracle of building something beautiful from the broken pieces of what came before. As Vivian curled against his side and they planned their weekend family activities, Marcus smiled at the memory of that autumn afternoon when he'd found her nursing his son. The moment that had felt like betrayal had actually been salvation, not just for Ethan, but for all of them. Sometimes the best things in life arrived disguised as disasters, and the greatest gifts came wrapped in the courage to trust again.